Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our training on labor trafficking, a closer look at human trafficking in the South Georgia fields. My name is Maya Hasek, and I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Director at Tapestry, which is a nonprofit social service agency that works for national victims of both sex and labor trafficking. Today, I will be facilitating a training that will be done by Solimar Mercado-Spencer, and she is a senior staff attorney at Georgia Legal Services, Farmworker Rights Division. So we work really closely with Georgia Legal Services. And with that being said, I'm gonna hand it to the real expert, Solimar. But before that, just very quickly, prior to getting started, I did add a link to an evaluation for this training. So please, after the training is done, take a few minutes to complete that. It shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Solimar.
Thank you, Maya. Can you share the PowerPoint, please? We're still looking at that NBC News page.
One moment, please. Technical difficulties. All right, let's see.
And while Maya gets that on the screen, thank you to Tapestry for hosting me today, and thank you all for joining us. I'll be just sharing some of our experiences representing some of farm workers in labor trafficking issues in South Georgia. Before I start, I'd like to put a plug for Georgia Legal Services. We are a non-for-profit legal services organization with offices all around Georgia and attorneys. And we have attorneys dealing with all kinds of different issues, from family law, housing, public benefits, you name it. It's free legal services for people who usually would not be able to afford to hire an attorney. My division focuses on farm workers, and because the state of Georgia relies so much on the H-2A program, most, if not all, of our cases in recent years have involved H-2A growers and H-2A workers. So with that, I'll start my presentation. Maya, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. And I want to start with giving you an opportunity to hear the story directly from a worker. I think it's important to show with actual examples of what's going on and hearing from the voices of the workers on these issues, so that we get a better idea of what's going on. And let's listen. If you bear with us, it's a 7-minute recording. It's not a video, it's a recording. I'd like for us to listen to this before I continue with my presentation.
This is Wisconsin Public Radio on NPR One. This is Wisconsin Public Radio on NPR One.
When you think about human trafficking, do you picture a tractor? A recent indictment landed a Georgia-based farm labor contractor in jail after he brought workers from Mexico to work on farms in the Racine area. Reporter Alex Hall spoke with one of those workers about how he wound up trafficked in Wisconsin.
Sí, vine legalmente a Estados Unidos.
Roberto is lanky, in his late 20s with hollow eyes and a goatee. He grew up in southern Mexico and lived there most of his life, until he met a man who said he could come to the United States and make good money, doing what he'd always done, work on a farm.
Ya él me dijo, si quieres venir a los Estados Unidos, si hay trabajo, pero...
The man was a recruiter. He explained that Roberto could travel to the United States legally on an H-2A visa, a work permit that enables farmers in the U.S. to hire workers from other countries to come here, plant and harvest crops, and then go back home.
Paga 7,000 pesos para que él te ponga en una lista.
In order to get on the list, Roberto would have to pay a fee and provide some sort of collateral.
Acepté.
Roberto accepted. He says his parents offered him the title to their land to give to the recruiter. But when he got to the U.S. and to his new job in Georgia, Roberto realized the setup was nothing like what the man had described. There were hundreds of workers, all men from Mexico who had been recruited like him. They lived in crowded barracks, isolated from the nearest town.
The same day you arrive, the same day they ask for your passport. They take all of your personal documents.
The boss warned Roberto and the other workers that there were ground rules.
He
tells us, get it in your heads. You came here to work. No matter what, they don't want us talking to any strangers. People who aren't from the job, and that we couldn't leave either.
That was 2016. If everything had gone according to plan, Roberto would be back in Mexico by now. But he's not. He's in Wisconsin. And Roberto is not his real name. We're hiding his identity because he and 13 other workers are the alleged victims of a labor trafficking scheme that the Department of Justice says brought workers from Mexico to the United States and eventually to Wisconsin.
Forced labor trafficking is a hidden crime.
That's Corinne Moreno-Taxman. She's an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin.
People think that when they're dealing with labor trafficking, that the way we would find victims in those cases would be finding someone chained to a sewing machine or a tractor, and that's really not what happens.
According to Polaris, a nonprofit that works to end human trafficking, labor trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery in which individuals work or provide services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. In Roberto's case, the coercion began once he arrived in the U.S., and it progressed into fraud a few months later. Roberto worked in Georgia for 3 months. One day, his boss said the workers were going to Wisconsin. They would be given green cards with fake names. Once they got there, it was much of the same. Hard work, long hours, mostly harvesting cabbage. Except that coming to Wisconsin violated the terms of the program. Now, the workers who had come into the country legally were no longer authorized to be in the U.S. Roberto says he kept an eye out to see if someone would stand up and do something. But no, he says we were all submissive because of the papers and what we left in Mexico. It was better to keep your head down and get through it. Documents obtained through Wisconsin's open records law showed that around this time, an anonymous caller reported to the state's Department of Workforce Development, or DWD, that Roberto and the other workers were being held almost like prisoners. A spokesman for DWD said the agency did follow up on the tip, but after interviewing the workers, could not substantiate the allegations. It did cite the farm labor contractor for preventing outreach workers from talking to the crew. Out in a cabbage field in rural southeast Wisconsin, the air is hot and humid. In the distance, you can see workers driving farm equipment. Occasionally, a car drives by. Not far from here, on November 10th, 2016, Roberto and the workers got up and started work just like any other grueling day. But something was different. All of the bosses left. So the workers rode out to the field by themselves in a school bus. They worked all day, and at night, when they were done, they got back in the bus and started making their way back to the hotel. As they drove, suddenly there was a sound.
De repente sonó la patrulla y le dijo al chofer que se parara y el señor.
All of a sudden, a siren sounded and they said, "Stop the bus."
Dijeron, tú maneja.
Law enforcement surrounded the bus.
Cuando salimos,
when we got out, the police detained us, all of us.
A todos ahí.
Documents show that police and federal agents had been investigating the farm labor contractor who hired Roberto. After the operation was busted, 5 people were charged with forced labor conspiracy. A spokesman for DWD said the agency's policy is to notify authorities when human trafficking is suspected. But outreach coordinators talked to the workers, and not one said they were being trafficked. But law enforcement and attorneys who work with survivors of human trafficking say sometimes victims don't know they're being trafficked.
I get a lot more sex trafficking cases brought to my desk than labor trafficking, so I guess that would be awareness, right? If more law enforcement knew what it was and knew what to look for, then I would be seeing more cases.
Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin, Julie Pfluger, who didn't work on Roberto's case, has been going after human traffickers since 2012. Pfluger says years ago, when she first started looking into sex trafficking, she had no idea if it was happening in Wisconsin or not.
My boss was like, hey, why don't you take a look and see if sex trafficking happens here?
She realized it was happening. It just wasn't on many people's radar, yet. Pfluger says that's kind of how it is with labor trafficking now.
People are now like, does it happen here? And I think once people start looking at it, it probably will be the same result. You know, maybe 5 years from now, we'll be looking back and going, well, of course it happens here. We just weren't looking for it the right way. We weren't educated. We didn't know how to find these cases.
The labor contractor who hired Roberto was eventually arrested and charged. He's currently out on bail. If convicted, the contractor and 4 of his family members face up to 20 years in prison. Alex Hall, Wisconsin Public Radio.
Okay, so you heard the story there of the workers who ended up in Wisconsin. This, unfortunately, is not a rare situation in South Georgia. We're finding that these H-2A visas lend themselves to abuse and to situations where employers basically have complete control over these workers. Another point I want to accentuate in this story is how at the end that agent was speaking about how law enforcement is not really looking for these cases. There's a lack of awareness, and when they're thinking about human trafficking, they first think about sex trafficking, trafficking of children, but not a lot of agencies are looking into labor trafficking of adult males, which does happen a lot. In Georgia, we haven't seen a lot of law enforcement agencies interested in prosecuting these cases, even though we have brought some examples to them. In fact, I want to tell you about an experience we had in a case where a group of workers were trying to escape a trafficking situation, and they left in the middle of the night to make sure that the employer would not see them leave. And as they were leaving, they gathered in a parking lot in front of a dollar store, and someone called the police on them. When the police arrived, instead of trying to assist them and treat them as victims they were, the police did was call their employer and basically report them to the employers so that the employer would come back and pick them up. So the employer, what happened in that case is the employer picked them up and put them in a bus to Florida. They were supposed to be working in Georgia. And then some of those workers we never heard from again. A couple of those workers did find a way to contact us from Florida, and we did help two from that crew, but there were like about 30 or 40 workers that we never heard back from. And it's an issue of lack of training, I think, lack of prioritizing these cases with law enforcement. And Amaya, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm just gonna touch on some of the definitions so that we know we all are in the same page about what kind of workers we're talking about here. Even though anybody can be a victim of human trafficking, you can be a US citizen, undocumented worker, or a visa worker, everyone can be vulnerable to human trafficking. But the cases that we're seeing, so I'm talking from our experience in South Georgia, is the exploitation of these H visa workers. So they come with temporary visas, so they are legal workers for what is termed unskilled labor, which I don't like that label, but It's as opposed to people who come from technology jobs or professional jobs. These are H-2A visas are for agriculture. H-2B visa are for other work, other employment, such as housekeepers, forestry workers, landscapers, people who work on hotels, poultry workers. Those are also workers that get a temporary work visa to come for a certain amount of time. And the visas are obtained by the employer. So the worker is only authorized to remain in the United States while they are working for that same employer, which you can see how that gives a lot of power to the employer over that worker. And then let's review the definition of a severe form of trafficking in persons. And that includes the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. It's a pretty broad definition. And Maya, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, here's a few more definitions. I am not gonna read them all, but we'll make sure that you get a copy of this presentation so that you can review the definitions. But these are the most common types of labor trafficking that we see. And the most common is probably forced labor. And that is when an individual provides or obtains labor by force, threats of force, physical restraint or threats of physical restraint, serious harm or threats of serious harm, abuse or threat and abuse of law, legal process, or any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the worker to believe that if the worker did not perform such labor, the worker or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint. And when it talks about serious harm, it doesn't have to be physical harm. It could be financial harm. It could be reputational harm. A lot of these workers, they're asked to pay recruitment fees in their home countries. So they're basically making a huge investment to come to the United States. And then once they're here, they depend on this employment to be able to pay back those. Sometimes they take loans to make that investment. Sometimes they have to give the titles to their land or their family's land. So they depend on this employment to get out of that debt. And losing their job would cause them serious harm or will cause them either not be able to pay those loans. Their family can lose their land. They can be they could face being sued when they get back to their country or persecution by the lenders. So that kind of, those are the kind of scenarios that we see a lot with H-2A workers. And next slide, please. And here's the definition of serious harm under the statute. It includes any harm that would compel someone in similar circumstances to continue working in order to avoid it. The harm need not be physical. And that's what I was talking about. So there's other kinds of harm, not necessarily violence. And something that we see a lot as well is the abuse or threatened abuse of law or the legal process that occurs when used for the purpose for which it was not designed or to exert pressure on another, and includes withholding of immigration documents or threats of deportation. So we see that a lot when the employers, once the worker crosses the border, the employer takes the worker's passports, their visas, so they can leave. And sometimes if they want to leave, they have to pay an amount of money to get their passport back to the employer. Next, please. And what makes these H-2 workers so vulnerable? There are many factors, particularly farm workers are very vulnerable because of racism, poverty, isolation, language barriers, educational barriers, cultural differences. So whether or not they're H-2A, undocumented, and even some what we call domestic workers, and those could be US citizens, could be legal residents, we find that in general, the farm worker population is a vulnerable group because they consist of immigrants. Sometimes they don't speak the language. Sometimes they have to do agricultural work because they have not achieved a lot of academic education, language barriers, and racism. But then you add, when you get H-2A workers, you add an extra layer of dependence on the sponsoring employer, which makes them extra vulnerable. Basically, their employer controls their work, their working conditions, how much they get paid, when they get paid, how much work they're gonna have. The employer controls the housing. So they're supposed, under the H-2A regulations, the employer is supposed to provide free housing to the workers that meets certain minimum standards. But the employer controls the housing. The employer controls transportation, whether the worker can after work can go shopping, or if they're sick, if they can go to the clinic or go do their laundry. Sometimes they depend on the employer for that transportation. Also the meals. Does the housing have an adequate kitchen that they can prepare their own meals? Do they have transportation to go buy materials to make their meals? And or if sometimes they're housed in motel rooms that have no adequate kitchens, then the employer is supposed to provide the meals. So the employer controls the meals, whether or not you eat, what time you eat, how much you're gonna spend on food, and so on. And of course, the immigration status, because they're only in the United States due to the H-2A visa that the employer procured for them. So it's like you're renting a person for several months to work for you.
Solimar, we have a quick question coming in from the chat.
Okay.
And the question is, how does labor trafficking in the US compare to other developed countries, particularly in Western Europe?
Oof, I am not an expert on what's happening in other countries. From experience, I worked in Florida several years ago, and we had a case of Thai workers. I don't know, some of you might have heard of this case called the Global Horizons case, because it was huge. And some of those workers have been trapped. So that company was like an international company. So not only they brought workers to the United States, but they would also bring workers to other countries. I don't remember which countries they were, but it was basically an international trafficking scheme. But really, I'm not the right person to ask this question, because I'm focused on Georgia, South Georgia. And what I'm bringing you is my experience from the cases that we've handled here. I'm not an expert. So continuing here, and well, also I'm thinking that these type of visas, if they have these type of visas, I believe in Canada they have a similar kind of visa. It lends itself whenever you have an employer that they have so much control over the worker, you're just asking for human trafficking. But yeah, I can't speak from experience. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. And then, so we were talking about how workers are so vulnerable, but and then you add another layer of why it is so difficult to help them. And I know that I think William from the Mexican consulate is here. This slide is yours. I stole it from your presentation. Thank you. It's a good slide. So they're sometimes hard to access because they're in rural areas. Sometimes they're housed behind the farm where it's you can't see it from the main road, and you have to go into dirt roads. Sometimes they're they're locked in with fences, and we just literally cannot go in to talk to them. Workers lack awareness and knowledge of their labor rights. Some workers are coming every year with H-2A visas, and they're exploited every year, but they're used to it, and they don't know that they can ask for better conditions. And unless we go in there and find them to tell them what the rights are, it'd be hard for them to know what they have a right, what their rights are. Seasonal workers have grown accustomed to pervasive conditions, and that's what I was talking about. So they're vulnerable because they come from poor communities. They need a job. They're desperate to earn some money, so they are willing to give up some of their freedom and some of their rights because they're hungry, they're desperate. So it's a tough decision for them. Lack opportunities and accumulation of debts reduces willingness to cooperate. That's another thing. Even if we reach them and we tell them what their rights are, and we say, if you need help, we're here to help. They're thinking about their families in their home country, how they need him or her to send money back this week so they can eat. So they don't have the luxury of confronting the employer to fight for their rights, because they have this immediate need of feeding their families, making sure that they don't lose the title to their home, to their land, to their family's land. So yeah, their priorities, they have such immediate priorities that they might not have the capacity to fight for their rights. They're afraid of retaliation and blacklisting, so they are threatened with, if you complain, I won't hire you next year, and nobody will hire you next year. And that's a strong threat for these workers who do not have any employment opportunities back in their home countries. Somebody I just saw a little comment here. How can we investigate blacklisting? And so it's hard to tell whether or not, when someone is being threatened with blacklisting, whether that's an empty threat, because generally H-2A workers, the employers have to apply with the Department of Labor and the immigration agencies and the U.S. consulate to approve the visas. And I doubt that there's some kind of blacklist at the U.S. consulate in Mexico or in other countries, not allowing workers in and denying visas. But the employer has to call you back. And one particular employer can decide not to call people back. So if you're blacklisted with that one employer, you could probably get an employment with another employer, but not with that employer. And that is very, very possible. Sometimes it's not just the employer, but employers go through recruiters, and one recruiter could be recruiting for 10 different employers. So if one of those 10 employers tells the recruiter, do not hire this guy for anyone, that guy might not hire them for any of those 10 employers. So again, it's hard to tell whether the threat, a particular threat of blacklisting, is an empty threat or if it's real, but it could be real. So it is a real fear. And then while retaliation is illegal, it is very, very difficult to bring those cases. Once a worker has been fired and sent back home to Mexico or Guatemala or wherever they came from, and they're not rehired the next year because they tried to fight for their rights, that's definitely retaliation. But it'll be very difficult for that worker from their home country to bring a lawsuit to sue the employer and find enough evidence to prove their case. It's just very difficult. There was one, and I should probably stay within the time. I kept talking about my experiences, but I'll just say something about retaliation. There was one case recently that we filed for retaliation, and that case was like clear cut. because the workers, they complain, and the Department of Labor, well, the Georgia Department of Labor showed up to investigate the complaint, and the next day the employer put the workers in a bus and sent them back to Mexico. So it was definitely absolute retaliation, and it could be proven. But usually it's not that clear. And it's just, you know, the worker's word against the employer's word, and that's hard to prove. And then somebody asked, Solimar, do you find that H2 workers are usually aware of their rights but are afraid to assert them, or are they not even aware of their rights? It's a mixed bag, I would say. A lot of workers know what their rights are, especially workers who come every year, so they know what's going on, but they just don't want to assert their rights because they don't want to risk not coming back next year. And then there's some, particularly ones that this might be their first year, who just don't know what's going on, and they did not read, or sometimes they did not get a copy of their contract to read it. And even if they got it, the job order is what we call the H2A contract that has all the terms and conditions. Those are kind of a technical documents, so it might be hard for some workers to understand. Sometimes they're not even fully in Spanish, even though they're supposed to be translated. So I would say to that question, it's a mixed bag. Some workers are very sophisticated. They know exactly what's going on, but they just don't want to risk losing their job. And some workers just don't know what their rights are. Pinpointing traffickers is challenging due to shared responsibility. And this is a huge problem with the H2A program. I think, the problem here is that a lot of growers, they use middlemen or agents. Well, they don't call it agents, but they call it recruiters, to recruit workers and to apply for these H2A visas. And then when something goes wrong, the growers can point to the recruiter or to the agent and say, that wasn't us, that was them. Go after them. And usually these middlemen, these recruiters, are just a glorified farm worker. They don't have the resources to pay damages. So if you can sue them, but then they don't have any money to pay what is owed to the workers. And sometimes it's hard to find out who is the big pocket at the end. So who's the pot at the end of the rainbow, the big grower that can pay the damages to the workers, because sometimes the workers don't know. They come with Juan Gomez to do work at different farms. They don't know who owns the farms. So it's challenging to find out who could be held responsible. Employers rely on authorities to reinforce threat and coercion. Yeah, when we're talking about rural South Georgia, sometimes the growers are very popular in the little communities. They provide employment, and they've been there for years. They are maybe the brother or the cousin of the sheriff or the local older judge. So they have a lot of power in those little communities, and the workers have no power at all. Lack of cooperation of employers, that's kind of obvious. Distrust in law enforcement and other service providers. So some workers come, they don't want to get in trouble, so they don't want to talk, they don't want to complain because they don't want to get in trouble, and they don't trust that law enforcement or service providers are going to protect them. And sometimes they might be right about that. Workers' lack of interest in performing extra activities after their strenuous workday. And that's, so usually when we go do an outreach visit to the workers, we go after they're done with their workday. So it's usually during the evenings when they're back in their migrant camps. And they're probably tired. They just want to rest, they want to eat. They don't want to hear us talking to them about their rights. And they don't want to get involved in a lawsuit where they have to be answering questions and doing all this extra work on top of their already very hard work. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to give you another example. This was a more recent case that we brought in South Georgia. And this was an example of a case where we could only find liability on the farm labor contractor. And even though we won a big damage award and attorney's fees and costs, we still yet to collect it because the guy is pretty much bankrupt. But still, it is a good example of what's happening in South Georgia. Like I said, these cases are not rare. This happens a lot, unfortunately, in South Georgia. Here's a snippet of the order from the judge. Defendant acted with reckless disregard to plaintiff's health, safety, and well-being when he intentionally recruited them, took them to Georgia, forced them to work without pay under threats of deportation, and subjected them to deplorable and dangerous living conditions for weeks. And that was a case of 13 H-2A workers. They settled with the Pine Star Company, and that's the big pocket at the end of the rainbow. It was a Pine Star Company, but due to how the law and the regulations are structured, it's very hard to find the company liable for all the violations. So we had to go after the farm labor contractor who was directly liable, and that's who owes the workers a huge chunk of money. And the pictures here, if you see, that is where some of the workers were sleeping. Those are like sheds in the backyard of a house. They were not insulated, so they were exposed to the outside. And if you look inside, look how the mattress was put. Is there? They don't have beds, mattress on the floor, and there's not even space for a mattress. That's definitely not within the standards, the housing standards required by the H-2A regulations or OSHA. Next slide, please. And how did we find out about this case? I think this is important because although these situations are not uncommon, like I said, what is uncommon is for us to find out about them because it's hard. I mean, workers are not going to come out and say, "Hey, I've been in traffic. Look at me," because they're working all day. In this particular scenario, what we found was that some neighbors next to that house, they noticed that there were a bunch of guys staying in the house, and they knew that there wasn't enough space in that house for that many people. So they approached the workers, they offered them food, blankets, and they even took some of the workers down. This is in this house that you saw the picture, that was Blackshear, Georgia. And some of the members from the local church took some of the workers to Savannah to make complaints with the U.S. Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour office. And they also get them in touch with us. And so that's how we got started. If it wasn't for those neighbors, we wouldn't have found these workers. Where did my presentation go?
Sorry, Solimar, I was trying to find us the link for this while you were talking.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I'm going to show you a video. This case made it to the ears of NBC News, and a group of reporters came down to Georgia. We showed them the area, we talked to them about the case, and then they followed some of the workers back to, after this case, some of them work in Texas. So I believe this video is them interviewing one of the workers. So you can go ahead and play it, Maya. Thank you.
Poder mantener a la familia. Vine a trabajar con el programa H2A, pero pues las cosas no salieron como yo esperaba. Nosotros dormimos afuera, prácticamente afuera de la casa, y esa vez hizo mucho frío. Sentíamos que podía pasarnos algo, tal vez hasta estar al borde de la muerte. Bueno, ¿qué haces? ¿Qué están haciendo los niños?
Yo estaba en el cuarto.
Yo todo el tiempo esperé pues darles un mejor futuro a mi familia.
In February 2018, Alberto came to the U.S. under the H-2A visa program.
The H-2A visa is a visa program that was implemented in 1986 under the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And it's basically an opportunity for growers to bring in temporary workers during their season where they have a shortage.
H-2A offers agricultural companies low-wage labor without any pathway to citizenship for workers. Farmers say the program is critically needed because they can't find enough domestic workers. Increasingly, they are using middlemen, known as labor contractors, to hire foreign farm workers and oversee them once they get to the U.S. Alberto was recruited in Mexico by Manuel Sanchez, a labor contractor based in Georgia. Alberto says he was assured that he'd earn more money harvesting pine straw than he would by staying in Mexico. He borrowed money from friends and paid Sanchez $1,000 to get him to the U.S. on an H-2A visa.
Todo estaba pasando bien ahí en México hasta que llegamos aquí y fue donde empezaron a cambiar las cosas. Esa casa donde vivíamos, donde nos metió Manuel, estaba muy vieja, tenía arañas, tenía cucarachas, el baño no servía, estaba muy cochina, muy sucia que estaba la casa. Se puede ver a simple vista donde la casa esa estuvo abandonada por mucho tiempo y Manuel allí nos fue a meter. No tenía calefacción y la temperatura bajó hasta 6 grados. A nosotros, a mí y a otros 4 compañeros nos tocó dormir afuera. Sentíamos que podía pasarnos tal vez hasta estar al borde de la muerte.
There's no annual cap on H-2A visas, so the program has been rapidly expanding, especially as the rural workforce has shrunk and the crackdown against undocumented immigrants has grown.
Expanding access to the H-2A visa, going to have them coming into our country in a easier fashion than even before. It's very important for our business, for our farms, for our ranches.
Industry groups say most employers treat their workers fairly, but as the program has grown, so have the number of documented labor violations, up 73% since 2014.
There's a lot of wage theft. A lot of workers don't know that they have a minimum wage. Recruitment fees are often exaggerated. Meal plans are sometimes implemented on workers and that aren't adequate.
El trabajo que nos explicó Manuel nos dijo que iban a ser pacas de pino. La paga no era la correcta. No hubo paga para nosotros. No nos daba tapabocas para cubrirnos la boca ni la nariz. Respirábamos todo el polvo. Pensábamos que Manuel nos iba a pagar fue cuando Manuel no se aparecía y nosotros le llamábamos y ya no nos contestaba. Después llegó y nos dijo que no nos iba a pagar. Al empezar la siguiente semana fue cuando Manuel intentó llevarnos a trabajar de nuevo y nosotros ya no quisimos ir.
Al pie con usted, o sea, usted fue el que nos trajo, ¿verdad? Sí. Y mire, si se arreglan las cosas, nosotros trabajamos con usted, no pasa nada. Que todo se haga, pues, todo. Mire, ahorita estamos comiendo, porque la gente nos trajo, no traemos que comprar.
Yo me sentía muy desesperado porque pues no podíamos conseguir el objetivo que era trabajar y conseguir dinero. Manuel nos tenía amenazados diciendo que él nos podía demandar a migración.
Manuel Sanchez hasn't responded to multiple requests for comment. More than 2 years later, the Labor Department's investigation of Manuel Sanchez is still ongoing. In a statement, the agency said they stress its commitment to safeguard American jobs and protect guest workers from being paid less than they are legally owed. They declined to answer questions about Manuel, citing the open investigation.
Workers, when they come, they're supposed to be reimbursed their travel expenses, any meal expenses, housing expenses that they had in their way here, and visa costs.
With the help of Georgia Legal Services, a nonprofit law firm, Alberto and 12 other workers filed a lawsuit against Sanchez.
Hacerle caso a la gente que nos decía que nosotros podíamos demandarlo, lo mejor que pudimos haber hecho.
In July 2019, a U.S. District Court made a default judgment and ruled against Manuel, declaring he owes the workers nearly $280,000 after subjecting them to forced labor, human trafficking, and deplorable conditions. And according to their lawyer, Alberto and other workers may never receive anything close to the money they are due, since Manuel has few holdings in his name in the U.S.
Ya ahorita ya voy a tener 2 años ahora en este mes, 2 años sin ver a mi hijo y a mi hija y a mi esposa, que es lo que más extraño.
Georgia Legal Services helped the workers obtain visas for trafficking victims, so they can stay in the U.S. for up to 4 years.
El domingo es el único día libre que tengo y normalmente pues lavo mi ropa un rato, regreso a la casa, descanso un rato, duermo un rato.
Alberto has started a new life in Houston. He works construction and has paid back the money he borrowed to pay Manuel originally. He's finally starting to earn the money that brought him to the U.S. in the first place.
Mis hijos que no se dieron cuenta a la hora de que yo me vine, porque me vine de noche, estaban dormidos y sin poder decirles algo que les iba a doler también a ellos, separarme de ellos.
Luna.
All right. So
obviously when the pandemic hit, we thought, hey, we can all be responsible adults and get this thing, in the bud. But that didn't happen.
Sorry, just
our
a
Christmas
second.
concerts have always been our most popular concert. We didn't really think about it until.
Okay. So I'm glad you guys got to listen to the recording at the beginning, the Borsinski case, and this video about the Sanchez case, because it tells you all you need to know about labor trafficking in South Georgia. It's happening. The H-2 visas are facilitating it, and there's not enough being done to prevent it. Our office is very small, so we are very limited on what we can do. It's only right now 2 attorneys and 2 paralegals for the whole state of Georgia. So, I mean, we need more law enforcement interest in this topic and interested in prosecuting these cases. So the next slide, and I think almost the end, so I can answer some, if there's any questions left, I can answer here in a few minutes. I just want to go over the different remedies that are available for victims of labor trafficking. There's a criminal prosecution of traffickers, and that's like the Borsinski case that was the first recording that we heard today. That case was the farm labor contractors were indicted in Wisconsin. But unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of interest in Georgia by either the federal or the state law enforcement agencies on cases like these. Then there's the civil lawsuit against the traffickers under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, TVPRA. And that's what we use in the Araguin versus Sanchez case, along with wage claims and contract claims. And the civil lawsuit is for money damages. That's all you can get is money. So if the trafficker doesn't have any money, then you get a judgment and you make your point that the court agrees with you that the person violated the law. But it would be so much more powerful if we could get law enforcement to prosecute these criminals and put them away so that they cannot keep doing this to other people. And then there's the humanitarian T visa and U visas, and that's also something we also help some of our clients obtain if they meet the eligibility requirements. And that allows the victim to remain in the country for up to 4 years and sort of recuperate from the trauma, find employment so they can pay back their debts, and sort of recuperate from all the damage that was done to them. And then there's also continued presence, which can only be offered by federal law enforcement, that's ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, or federal prosecutors. And that would be kind of like a T visa. It's a temporary work permit and allows the person to stay in the United States while law enforcement is investigating the case. Then next slide, please. And that's my call to action. Like I mentioned in the Sanchez case, we found out about those workers because the community saw them and they looked for help. That's the only way for us to find, to help victims of trafficking, is for the community to be alert to these issues. And to, if you see something, say something. You can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can call our office. You can call Tapestry. And if we can help them, we can certainly point them to the right direction. And now is that my last slide? Yeah. So I want to see if there's any questions that I missed. You want to help me with that, Maya?
Sure. I don't know if there were any questions missed. Some questions were answered by others, but I do want to say that we have law enforcement, specifically HSI, volunteering to take some of the cases in the middle Georgia. So I just want to put that out there. HSI, if you want to unmute yourself, we'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, I'm going to get the link for our evaluation and put it in the chat box. All right, let me look.
Hi, Maya. This is Danica here. I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar and training will be placed on our YouTube channel, which I have put in the chat box. It'll be up as soon as the video has rendered and we've completed this. But we have our other trainings for the month of January that are already on there, and any ones that are going to be coming up soon will be placed on that as well. So please feel free to subscribe.
Thank you, Danica. And if anybody has any questions, please type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself.
I see a question about the Grace Commission. It says, how does Grace Commission help, if it helps at all? I don't know what that is. If
Sure, I can answer.
Go ahead.
I can do my best. So the Grace Commission is a commission. Sorry, I don't know the acronym off the top of my head, but it was created by the First Lady. And my understanding is that it is made up of social service agency that works specifically with domestic minor victims of sex trafficking. So there has been some talk about inclusion of labor, both dealing with minors and adults. I'll just say, I'm not aware of what exactly is being done right now, but I'd say I will just volunteer Georgia Legal Services and Tapestry to be a part of that committee if we should be invited, so we can introduce more information on labor trafficking and kind of push policies that protect survivors of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking.
Thank you. And then my contact information is in the last slide. Please feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. Also follow us on Facebook. There's our Facebook page. But I'm really accessible through email, even more so than don't call me unless you really need me. But by email, I will definitely reply when I'm available.
And Solimar, I think one question came in. Do you see a role for the larger companies that are buying from these South Georgia producers to push for improvements and or make space for the efforts of local advocates?
Well, okay. So I'm going to put it out there that I am a recipient of Legal Services Corporation funding. So I cannot advocate for changes in the law or for lobbying or anything like that. But definitely some things can be done from the grassroots groups to do some more impact changes to the law and to big corporations that have more power than the workers to make change. But I really am not supposed to. I have restrictions due to my funding to speak on that.
Well, I think maybe if you don't mind, Solimar, I know you have restrictions, but there is an organization in Florida called Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And basically they'll do grassroots organizing, and they'll go to Publix, Taco Bell, and advocate for them to pay a higher price for produce, which in turn is supposed to increase wages of these workers that are working on the farms, both in Florida, Georgia, and across the country. So there is an opportunity for kind of grassroots movements to make changes at that level.
Yeah, I think that's something that's kind of missing in Georgia. It's an advocacy group for farm workers that is not funded by the federal government. So they have more flexibility on what actions they can take, sort of like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. There's different groups. There's more groups in Florida advocating for workers than there are in Georgia.
Absolutely, and we appreciate your expertise and your time, Solimar, because I know you are the lead, if not the only agency covering the entire state of Georgia, both educating the workers, representing the workers in court, as well as applying for that humanitarian relief. So we appreciate everything that you do and the expertise that you shared with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Maya and Tapestry. And again, feel free to email me any follow-up questions. I will be responding.
And I'd just like to take 1 minute. I apologize. There was a question in the chat box that I think we missed. As far as, are there any groups in the state of Georgia that individuals could join? There is a statewide human trafficking task force. And you can look on the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council website for more information on that. All right, and I think we are at 2:59. We have had some contact information shared through the chat from HSI. Thank you so much. We'd love to partner with you on future cases, and maybe Solimar would like to take this down as well. But you have our contact information. I can go back to the last slide of the presentation, so you have Solimar's direct contact, and I will type my direct email in the chat box as well.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and conclude today's training. If you have additional questions, please either email myself, Maya at tapestry.org, or Solimar at the email, or you can contact me and I will share her contact information. Thank you so much and have a great day. Thank you for joining.